So in terms of training itself, so we have part of our sort of 5 R's plan, which was a plan that we came up with last year to combat burnout that was really coming out of the pandemic. One of those pieces was reboarding, and that was reboarding our managers. So we had all these managers who they know how to manage, but what they didn't necessarily know was how to manage in a hybrid environment specifically.
Sure.
Again, where we've got some folks who might be co-located and some folks remote.
Yeah.
So that training has been critical.
Hey everyone, welcome to Leading From Afar, a show by remote leaders for remote leaders, where we dive into the most important topics facing leaders in the future of work. I'm your host, Scott Markovitz. I was the first hire at Envision, one of the first all-remote companies back in 2012. I've since helped build and scale multiple remote teams as an early employee or consultant. In each episode, we geek out doing deep dives on specific topics like within async, hiring the best talent anywhere, how to create a fun and engaging environment remotely, and so much more. This show was created to help managers leading remotely upskill themselves to help them build world-class remote cultures. If you enjoy this content, please feel free to support me by subscribing in your favorite podcasting app, share it with friends and colleagues, and feel free to buy me a coffee via the show's website. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to today's show. I'm your host, Scott Markovitz, and today I'm joined by Meaghan Williams from HubSpot. I was really stoked about this conversation as first and hopefully a few episodes in a series of how bigger companies pivoted to remote. When the pandemic hit, startups of 25, maybe 50 people could really pull the Band-Aid and go remote overnight. But how did companies of hundreds or thousands of people do it and do it successfully? So I've known that HubSpot has supported remote work for quite a few years, but really didn't know the extent or how much amazing work has already been done and been done for the last few years around team engagement, leadership training, building a hybrid culture, and a heck of a lot more. So in this episode, we spoke about what remote looked like at HubSpot before the pandemic. What did it look like during those chaotic first days, first weeks, and all throughout the pandemic, and what HubSpot is thinking about and working on for post-COVID. It was a fascinating conversation and one that would really help every leader still struggling with how to do remote the right way. Hope you enjoy. Hey, Meaghan, how you doing today?
Hey, Scott, I'm doing well. Thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining. So calling in from Boston, are you at an official office? Because I see like a brick background. So I don't know if this is like, like the nice kind of fashionable, they say like apartment backgrounds, like a bare brick background, or this is part of maybe like a HubSpot space background.
I know it's very deceptive that way. HubSpot is a lot of brick. I am actually in my home, and this is the one brick wall we have in this house, and I set my office up right in front of it. Love it. That's awesome.
How's everything in Boston?
Things are good. Yeah, we are being treated to a long-awaited rainy day. So it's the day after a long weekend here, rainy day. We're getting into fall.
Nice.
So it's a good day to be working from home, my favorite type of day.
Absolutely.
How are things over where you are?
Yeah, everything's good. Still hot and sunny here. So I definitely miss, I think it was the last episode I recorded, I spoke about it. Someone in one of my networks had mentioned, I think they were in upstate New York, and this was maybe like 1 or 2 weeks ago, and they said, we went outside, and you got like that smell, the first smell of like fall. And I remember back in the days of New York, it was somewhere like around now, going outside and then thinking, okay, you get this fall smell. Football season's coming, great. Pumpkin spice, everything pumpkin spice is coming soon.
Pumpkin spice.
Exactly. So all these things are coming down the pipe. But here, just, for another couple of months, it's still warm and sunny. But so long as I don't get the cold winters, I'm very happy.
Seems like a fair trade-off.
Indeed. So before we dive into the topic, again, the way I've liked to start off conversations is with a non-topic topic, just to get the conversation started. And noticing, we're going to actually like dive into this, so it's somewhat related, that you held, and you've been holding a kind of a remote role at HubSpot. One of the big things like the last 12 or so months is this idea of head of remote. Now everyone looking for head of remote. I'm very bullish, sorry, not bearish. I'm quite negative on this role. I'm a big believer. I've interviewed for a number of these roles. I've spoken to lots of recruiters. I've spoken to lots of companies that are hiring in this role. And it seems very much they're not looking for the right person. I kind of feel that we really don't know what they really look for. And they're kind of seeming to look for someone who has someone who's going to implement tools. Like, what's the right collaboration tool? What's the right video tool? What's the right documentation tool versus it's a much bigger kind of holistic picture. For me, I did at least one episode last season with the idea of the head of remote is really the new COO. Someone that, coming from my experience being the first hire at Envision and being the operations person, when building and scaling the company, every day was involved in finance and in IT and in operations and in HR and in all these different aspects. And if you really want, because, right, what is remote? Remote is not the physical location, okay, where maybe it's an operational thing where you have to send a payroll or something like that. There's legal things and it's a culture piece. And there's so much that's involved here that very few people, I think, have this experience. So I kind of would love to get your sense of, again, having a role where you're trying to build a remote culture and help the remote experience. But I'd love to kind of hear your 2 cents on what is this role about? Are people even looking for the right thing? Let me know, what are you thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I think that I agree with you in the sense that when it comes to, what makes a great head of remote, if you will, I think a huge piece of it is exactly as you mentioned, that if you're going to have a head of remote, that person needs to understand, how all of the legalities work in your different entities. They need to have a sense of what the taxes are going to look like with a remote workforce. Yes, there's a culture side. Yes, there's a technology side, but there's also a hiring side and a legal side. There's so much that comes into it that I think that if one person's going to sort of be at the top of those decisions, absolutely, it is going to be someone that can be knowledgeable on all of those different pieces. On the flip side, I think that it's important to note that when it comes to a truly remote first company, or even a hybrid company like HubSpot, it has to be everyone's job to make remote work, right? So it can't come down to this one person or even this one team. I think everybody has to agree that we're going to make remote work together. Yeah. And so I think it's a balance of both. But, I think that's something I quickly learned when I started out in my role at HubSpot is, understanding how much goes into remote work and how many different players you need to have involved in those conversations to make it work successfully.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So the kind of first question is a very easy question. The way we start off every episode is just telling us a little bit more about yourself. And obviously we kind of tease to the idea of you've been in a kind of remote experience role at HubSpot. So tell us a little bit more about the role and what you do in that role.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started in this role back in 2019, well, really 2018 when the job was posted. HubSpot had a population of maybe 100 remote employees. 95% of them were in the US, but they were noticing that this was becoming an increasingly popular option. They also, to their credit, noticed that there wasn't really anyone fully putting together guidelines, processes. No one was really sort of leading the charge on remote. And one thing we believe about HubSpot is that our culture is so important. The employee experience is so important. And so even though it was 100 employees, they wanted to make sure that those folks had an excellent experience and had an equitable experience. And so prior to the pandemic, they posted this role at the time. It was titled Remote Work and Inclusion Program Manager. And I was fortunate. It was the dream job at the time. It still is. I was incredibly fortunate to be able to get that position. And that first year, I was learning a ton. I
can imagine.
Together, yeah, exactly. There was no process in place. There were no guidelines. You wanted to go remote. Some folks would just ask their manager. Some folks would put on a presentation, right? Things were happening all over the place. And so my job was really to create some guidelines and some consistency to how we approached remote work. And then making sure that for anyone who was remote, again, were they able to get a promotion? Were they able to attend culture events? Were they able to really and truly engage in conversations and ideas and opportunities versus just watching them happen on a Zoom screen?
Yeah.
And so that's what I worked on really the first year. And then, of course, COVID hit a year later. Our entire company went remote. So it was a busy year, but we I was thinking about all those lessons that I've been fortunate to learn really from our remote population, thinking about how do we now empower this global company that for many of whom they had never worked remotely before.
Sure.
How do we teach them the best practices so that they can continue on in this world? And then once we went fully hybrid, it was really about adjusting those lessons for a hybrid versus fully remote environment.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm hoping to do a couple of episodes that are very, very much focused. I've had this interest, at least for the past year, to speak with people like yourself who have been working with a company that is more than 25 people, right? When the pandemic hit, or if you think about it, when companies switched over to remote, okay, if you have a startup, 25 people, 50 people, right? You can pull the Band-Aid and say, okay, tomorrow we're remote. We're going to get, Slack and Notion and whatever we're going to do. We're going to do this thing. And okay, it's going to be painful for a couple of weeks, but we're going to get through it. When we're talking about hundreds or even larger companies, like it's a totally different story. So my hope is kind of an across number of episodes to really get the story of where it started and how it moved and what the transition was, like the first day, the first week, the first month, like all throughout that, and kind of the plans afterwards. So I think the easiest place or the best place to start is obviously, right, the origin story. You had mentioned there were a couple of people who wanted to work remotely. Like, again, it's not, you had companies that during the pandemic were in the office and then overnight remote. Or the other side was you had companies that started remote first day. You didn't really have companies that said, okay, we're in the office and you know what? Hey, let's try this remote thing. Or there was a handful of people who wanted to do. So I'd love to maybe understand, like, again, maybe a deeper dive of like what that origin story was. Was it people that were maybe in Boston that wanted to move out or had some kind of, whatever scenario that they said, hey, I wanted to work remotely, and like what that process was to say, okay, this group, and like, again, is there a structure? Like exactly what did the origin story of this all look like here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've actually had remote employees since our very earliest days of the business. We hired our first remote employee back when we were a tiny startup, and it was essentially, they found the right guy for the job, and he happened to live in Arizona at the time. And so they made it work. And then I think primarily we were, based in our Cambridge office, and that's where most people were. But as HubSpot grew and evolved, we had these employees who were incredible. They loved HubSpot. We did not want to lose them, but life was taking them elsewhere. Maybe their partner got a job, maybe they needed to move back in with family to be a caretaker. Any number of reasons could have brought them to the decision of needing to go remote. And I think it kind of aligns nicely, again, with our culture. Yeah. We kind of said, we'll make it work. Right? We didn't have a full process, but we didn't want to lose these employees. We wanted to make it work for them. And so we allowed folks to go remotely sort of organically. But it was at that point of around 100 employees where we realized this is becoming a trend, right? This is something that is really picking up steam. And if we're going to get this right, then we need to really put some guidelines, process in place, and make sure that these folks are being taken care of and aren't going to go remote and then get stuck in their career. That was a big concern of HubSpot. So that's ultimately how it evolved.
Awesome. I would love it. Even let's, again, my hope is really to nerd out here and really just go really deep and really go deep on this topic, because it's beautiful to hear like the idea, okay, we had people early on and we wanted to make sure we did this right? Again, wasn't this now, so we spoke about head of remote, what tools, what communication, whatever tools can we bring in? We want to be able to hire the right way. We want to be able to onboard the right way. We want to make sure that there is no proximity bias and preventing people from rising up. So these were things that were thought about early on. If you can, let's try to dive as deep as we can of like what that early process, what did it look like? Like, again, were we hiring people, but maybe we were hiring people as contractors instead of full-time employees? Again, maybe especially if they're outside of the U.S. Again, the companies like Deal and Oyster and employee record companies didn't exist. and that's how we started Envision. And we hired everybody as a contractor, PayPal or wire transfer them money every month. And then like, what were the processes? What were the documentation? Like what kind of I would love to hear like just more about those early days of what you're doing that first role.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it was really interesting in the sense that one thing that's true about HubSpot is that we really believe in the full-time model, and that's because our founders wanted everyone to be able to have full transparency and to be a shareholder. And so because we didn't have that contractor model prior to my role being introduced, every time someone wanted to go remote, essentially everyone had to sort of get together and figure out a point solution. So for example, we've got someone who is going to be, let's say, in Ohio. We need to make sure that we're taxing them correctly. We're a New England-based company. Do we have benefits that are going to reach them? We've got someone from benefits, someone from payroll, someone from HR, making sure that all of these things are happening. Then you maybe add in, different entities that, depending on the country, sometimes there are, elements of compliance and regulations that require very specific needs for someone who's working in a home versus in an office. That's made even more intricate when you add in something like a visa to the process. So again, we sort of, for each individual employee, pulled in all these teams to make it work and get it right. The challenge was, again, that just wasn't going to scale. So when I came in, one of the things that I did was I looked through the entire employee life cycle from the time that we're interviewing them all the way to what does an offer letter look like if you're working from home in different states or, again, countries as the case may be. Things like, do your benefits or taxes change if you are going to be working in a certain state in Germany versus Berlin? And I really dove into all of that, put it all into documentation, and then started to automate the processes so that as these requests started to pour in, we didn't have these meetings happening for individual employees. We just had a process. And it took a lot of time to get set up and a lot of stakeholders. But that's why I say a lot of my job was really project management at the start. Because I was just getting everyone in the same room and figuring out who needs to do what in which order to make sure this is going to work at the end of the day.
And it's quite a valuable thing that you have done, because it's obviously setting up the foundations for what the next question is going to be. March 11th, March 14th, something like that, 2020, bang, everything in the world closes, everybody's for home. Again, these companies who didn't have this, it was like literally pulling the Band-Aid, lights on, lights off. You're in the office yesterday, today you're home. Would love to hear again that experience of like, what did day one look like? What did week one, month one? What was the communication? Seemingly, it came from the executive team. What was the plan? Like, thinking about, again, nobody expected this to last as long as it did. Were there thoughts, especially because you had a foundational piece there, were there thoughts around, okay, people may not have a proper desk and setup? Is there thoughts of, okay, do they have the right equipment? And if not, do we get them that? If they're now working from home, and like the benefits, and do we pay for maybe electricity, internet? Again, I would love you to just take me through, what did day one look like? What did week one look like? What did month look like?
Yeah, it was a wild month, I'll tell you that.
Oh boy.
The good news for us was that at the time we had 9 entities. And so in those 9 entities, we had the ability to have remote employees in all 9. So we had already had the groundwork of the benefits, the taxes, what the paperwork needed to look like, all the compliance regulations. So we were very fortunate that work was foundational and
absolutely
done. What I think was hard for us was that prior to COVID, we would say that, if you want to work remotely, that's where you do your best work. That's amazing. We can get you set up, but it is your choice and your responsibility.
So
you need to have a space that's going to work for you. You need to be able to have, a strong internet connection. But to your point, we now are in a situation where folks are living with 5 roommates, or they have 4 kids at home. Their internet connection isn't great. And so how do you enable folks for whom they don't have the ideal situation, and furthermore, they don't do their best work at home? That was a situation we had never been in. We were, prior to COVID, enabling folks who wanted to work remotely. Now we're trying to help folks adjust who did not want to be there and were not doing their best work remotely. And so we did that in a couple of different ways. I think the biggest piece was empathy and flexibility. We were very transparent with our managers and with our entire employee base that this isn't going to be easy for anyone. We need to be empathetic. One thing I love is that we very much embraced, your kids want to join the Zoom.
Not only do you
want that, Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
We actually set up like kids events. We had events where we would specifically bring kids in. So there was a lot of that. We tried to do a lot of experimentation around, does camera off help people?
Yep.
Do more Zoom meetings and more sort of, coffee hours help people, or is that exhausting at a certain point?
Yep.
So there was a ton of experimentation there. Ultimately, we did end up providing people a stipend to help get them set up with their desk and all of that stuff. We also, once we went into a sort of full hybrid model, introduced remote monthly stipends, which I think helped with the internet piece.
Sure.
But those first few months of adjustment, they were really hard. I think we learned a ton, but it was very different from the approach that we had been using for a year. And I think that some of our biggest growing pains and lessons were learned in those few months.
Let's deep dive on that. Off the idea, I want to talk about the kids part next. But one of the things I heard consistently, I helped a lot of companies move over to remote, that especially without the idea of presence, right? Productivity used to be based on presence. So then they would kind of replace those I see you with, okay, let's do a morning Zoom stand up and an afternoon Zoom stand up and like all these things. I had to know what you're doing. So even like, what did even that look? Were there like new processes? Because again, you had some process in place, but in theory, it was probably just one person who was just kind of getting along with their team, and whatever the team was doing, they just kind of fell in line with. Now, an entire team's not there. Very few managers had obviously the opportunity and the experience of leading remotely. So most people that I've come across have done it wrong, and I can't blame them because they had no idea what they're doing. But even what did that look like? Were there new processes put into place? Like what did that look like? Or again, because you had that structure, you had some people working remotely, you really kind of knew what the right way to work remotely was versus, again, unfortunately, these Zoom fatigues and all the other things that people complain about, and adding in check-ins and all this, replacing the idea of presence with virtual presence.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, we were lucky that we already had a lot of managers who were doing this well and had figured this out. We had manager training that we could fall back on that was specific to managing remote employees. That said, we really hadn't been in this situation, with the exception of one team. We didn't have any teams that were fully remote, never mind, across different time zones. And so it was an adjustment for a lot of managers. And as I'm sure you've seen in your work, there's a lot of folks who, they want to do a good job, but they don't know how to do it in this environment. And that's where I think we see these legends of, keep your Slack doc green, like check in every morning. And I think we're fortunate that we didn't encounter that behavior so much, but what we did have was a lot of managers who were just feeling lost. They didn't know how to support their teams in this environment. And so what we did was, we scheduled AMAs with myself and with our management and leadership development team, where we just gave managers a safe space, frankly.
That's awesome.
Help them talk about what's scary for you. What do you not know how to do? Where do you need guidance?
That's fantastic.
So there was a lot of lessons that way and training that way. We came out with training that was more specific to leading in an all remote environment versus just including one remote person in an otherwise office environment, which, there's a nuance there.
Oh, for sure.
And then I think the third thing is really just reminding folks what our culture code says, which is it's not about the number of hours you work, right? I don't care if your Slack dot is green. What I care about is what you've produced and the results at the end of the day or for the month. And so what we really have our managers focus on is like, what are those results, right?
Yeah.
If you're in, sales and services and support, that might be metrics based, but if you're not, you always need to know as a manager, what is the outcome? It really doesn't matter how they get there, as long as that's what they deliver at the end of the day. And your job is to support them on that journey, not to surveil them along that journey.
It's absolutely music to my ears. And I want to take that last point and pull it out, because this is also something that I've spoken about, probably I think more on season 1, where I've for years since I've been remote, I've always spoken to, especially founders, that the idea of work is not presence, it's output, right? It's a simple math equation. You have a specific deliverable by a specific time. If you've done it, check the box, you've done great. But as you said, if you're a developer, you push code to GitHub. If you're a customer support person, you answer 20 tickets in whatever tool it may be. But there are certain roles, especially I think more than anything else, like operational roles, where you don't really see the end product as much, or it is not like on a day-to-day basis. It's not. So if you implement this new process to remote engagement or something like that, and you have new tools to make coffee breaks or things like that, you're not going to get feedback like a week later, like, oh my God, my remote experience went from a 2 to a 10 just by this. Like, it's going to take weeks and months and things like that. So in that specific environment, when you're thinking about that, and again, that's the absolute right way to do it, it's based on output. With those types of roles, like how has HubSpot kind of looked at that, where you have an operational thing? You may never get that feedback, or it may come like trickle in from employee feedback and engagement surveys after something is rolled out before. Like, what does that kind of look like, where, again, it's not as easy, code change, support tickets, sales close, things like that?
Yeah, when there's not those hard metrics, it's so hard.
Exactly.
That's true of my role, right?
Yeah.
There's no hard metric to find for my success. Same with my team.
Yep.
And so what we encourage managers to do is we have a lot of templates, one-to-one. We have templates for what you should be talking about. What are you working on? What are your goals? What does success look like? We use short lists here. So what are the 5 things you're going to focus on and accomplish? But some of those are going to be long-term projects.
Sure.
They might be just in planning meetings and project management meetings for months at a time.
Yeah.
But again, sort of relevant to asynchronous communication, all of that should be documented. And I think that that's really what we encourage managers to think about is, where is the progress seen? Where is it documented? What is the output, even if the final result isn't ready or the feedback hasn't come in yet?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you've hired that person to do a job. What was the job? What did you need them to do? Yeah. And what are the sort of stepping stones? So that can be a tough conversation for managers. We also have a template around setting expectations in the first week, and we talk very directly about what does success look like in the first 30, 60, and 90 days, and we track it. What does success look like a year from now? How will I know if I'm not doing well? Where are we going to track progress? And so we really push managers and their team members to put all of that out there on a document and have that conversation in week 1. Because that also kind of eliminates the anxiety, right?
For sure.
You never want to be in a job where you're worried about, am I doing a good job or not?
Exactly. Yep.
I think that's key. And I'm sure that you've seen that in the various roles that you've held too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially in the operational roles, it's, as we mentioned, there is no key deliverable. There isn't any sale. There isn't money that hits the account or no new feature or blog post that goes out. So it's, looking in theory what the impact is. So especially with maybe those remote experience, okay, you do your pulse surveys, it comes back like this. You implement new changes, new whatever it may be, do pulse surveys afterwards, you get feedback. Like, has there been a change, a positive change in the right direction? And yes, some things obviously take longer. Maybe I'll leave the kids part for the end, but it's phenomenal to hear. Like, there was so much thought process around this and templates and documentation that were ready from kind of day one. Because, in theory, this is how the podcast started. Back in January 2021, I said, no, what good can I do for the world, right? Everyone was struggling to be able to lead remotely, again, Zooms all day long. And I said, hey, I've been doing this for 8+ years. I've been building and leading remote companies. Let me share my experience and what I do and what worked and what didn't work and bring on people. And it was just to kind of give that opportunity for upskilling, just some kind of training in some capacity, because again, there's very little that exists out there still to this day for kind of training in that space, and so much more within a company that had it. So it's absolutely fantastic to hear that. So I'm going to move on. So we kind of spoke, okay, day one, things were in process. So again, the expectation originally, right, was COVID, okay, it's going to be a couple of weeks. So people go home, okay, they work from like their kitchen table, whatever, the setups aren't right, and we'll figure out taxes and things later. But then like month 1 goes to 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And there must have been at some point where the team thought, hey, this may be like a longer term thing that we're thinking about. And like, what was there at that point, like what maybe time point, like what was the inflection of, okay, we kind of just, again, HubSpot obviously did a lot better of a job having more process and pieces in place, but was there kind of a transition of, okay, now we really need to go into overdrive, again, maybe now making sure that people have the stipends and making sure that all these different processes and things set up, because we're thinking, okay, this may not be over, as soon as we hear it. So I'd love to hear if there was it at some point where you kind of realized, hey, this may be a longer term thing. How do we set ourselves up for working remotely as an entire organization for the long term?
Yeah, I think there were really 2 points. So one was probably towards mid-summer of 2020. And we sort of started talking about like, this is the new normal, right? We heard all the time just around the world, when we go back to the office, when this is over. And I think we really had to embrace the fact that like, no, this is it. It's going to be this way for a while. And so what we encourage folks to do is for anyone who was maybe hesitant to fully embrace this model and was just waiting for it to end. Push folks again with training and with enablement, with documentation.
That's amazing.
Let's embrace it because we're not going to change anytime soon. So what do you need to make it work? And we encourage them to really take on those best practices. So little things like updating your Slack status, your calendar. And we gave them just tips, small things you can do that's going to make this easier as we sort of embrace the fact that this is going to be a little longer than we expected. And then I think the second pivot point was, as we ended 2020, we went all in on this hybrid model where we introduced, instead of a world where we had the office or remote, it was office, flex, remote. And so that was where we fully went in on that strategy. We introduced the stipends. We introduced all of the new models of how often you can come into the office and what that looks like, how often you get to choose. And I think that gave folks sort of a new vision around remote work. Everybody does truly do their best work in different places and sometimes at different times.
Absolutely.
And so depending on which entity you were in, COVID was going a little bit differently by the end of 2020. And so it gave us a chance to embrace that from a global strategy and recognize that, things look different in the different countries we operated in. And so we had the strategy that could carry over through all those different places.
That's awesome. So I'd love to hear, like, as this process was moving along, like, what did you learn? Because obviously it was a learning process. What were some of those things that you learned? What were some assumptions that you had early on that worked out and ones that didn't? And what were maybe some things that went right and some things that went wrong?
Yeah. COVID was definitely, it was a huge learning opportunity for me, I think, alongside like learning to make sourdough with everyone else. I had a lot of lessons learned. I had a lot of mistakes made. And I think that, a big one was this assumption that you can sort of create an environment for someone that will enable them to do their best work. There are people for whom working from home, it's just never going to be their ideal situation. You can throw money at them, you can throw debt, whatever you want. They want to be surrounded by their coworkers. They want to be outside of their home.
Absolutely.
I think that was really hard for me as someone that chooses to work from home to fully embrace. But, we heard that from employees. We heard, I want to be in the office or I want to be in a co-working space. I can't. And so that was a big learning for me. I think another thing was just about how you sort of embrace life and work. One particular mistake that I speak to often is I used to talk to people about, your best work from home setup is a neutral background. You want to eliminate noises, eliminate distraction. And naturally, what that made people feel was, I can't bring my whole self to the Zoom.
Absolutely.
I can't bring my whole self to work. Should I worry about my kids entering the screen or my dog barking or the poster I have in the background? And so I had to really take a step back and realize that my intentions were to have sort of an easier space for conversation, but that wasn't the impact that I had. And so we took a step back with our recruiting team so that all the way up to your interview, you knew that you could show up to that Zoom in a way that you felt truly represented yourself without worry about kids and posters and whatever's in your background. And so I think that sort of perfect home office or, perfect neutral setup that we see on Pinterest, that's not the way it should be.
Not at all.
And that was a bit of a learning for me too. And I think an important lesson in what it means to truly work from home and have that work-life balance where you feel authentic and you can bring your whole self to work.
No, that's amazing. I mean, it brings me back even the beginning of days of Envision. We had probably about, I think, 2 people early on that were absolutely fantastic employees, but they just didn't work out because they couldn't get past that idea of working from home. Like they needed people, they needed noise, and they needed action, and it just didn't work out. I mean, they were great, but they just, for years, it's funny, I've gone back and forth For a long time, I said, okay, the future of work is a combination of remote and co-working. And then I kind of, during the pandemic, when everyone's working from home, I'm like, okay, well, obviously work from home, that's the future. Forget like having to go anywhere. And like, I've kind of, flip-flop back and forth. I'm still like, go back in like the camp of, yes, there are people who just can't work at home from whatever reason. And I think like I'm a big believer in the idea of the third space. I think the central headquarters, that idea will be dead, hopefully in a couple of years. But yeah, it's interesting to kind of see that and also the experience of, I've argued this point of, getting to know people and how building relationships. In the office, you get to know people better. I said, I know people much better from seeing them on Zoom than I ever did in the office, because in the office, it's like, hey, Megan, the people ops person. Hey, Scott, the support person. That's all I know. But when I see you at home and like, oh, that book, I read that one, or the things like, whatever, crocheting things, and I see your kids, or you have a cat, or like, I get to see you as like the parent and the animal lover and the plant thing and the reader of this. I get to get so much more of a deep sense of who you are. I've had so many of those cases where I'll see, especially like a picture in the background. I had one, I think last week, where I saw somebody like whitewater rafting. So I used to love whitewater rafting when I was young. And like, as soon as I saw that, like, it just brought up that conversation, and you get to pick up something and then build a conversation, potentially a relationship on something that you, again, would never have known about that person to begin with. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
100%.
So I kind of maybe moving on a little bit. So again, you've had the processes, you've had the procedures, unlike most companies. Would love to maybe hear what tools, and I know you kind of mentioned training a little bit, if there were any like actual courses, like a manager would actually go through like a multiple-week course or any kind of like something like that you implemented, to make remote more successful with HubSpot. And like, what are you thinking about in the future?
Yeah. So in terms of training itself, so we have a part of our sort of 5 R's plan, which was a plan that we came up with last year to combat burnout that was really coming out of the pandemic. One of those pieces was reboarding, and that was reboarding our managers. So we had all these managers who they know how to manage. What they didn't necessarily know was how to manage in a hybrid environment specifically.
Sure.
Again, where we've got some folks who might be co-located and some folks remote.
Yeah.
So that training has been critical. And then in terms of the tools themselves, I think tools are what really make or break work for you.
Sure.
And for us, I think it really breaks down to 3 categories, right? There's tools for business communication. That's tools for us. That would be Zoom, sometimes Slack. It depends on how you use Slack.
Sure.
For us, asynchronous is also, we use Loom a ton. It's super helpful when we have global teams, especially.
Sure.
Obviously, things like Google Suite, even email, those are great asynchronous tools for us. And then tools for collaboration, things like Lucid, Asana, Smartsheet. I would argue all 3 of those categories absolutely have to be present if you're going to have an effective strategy and make all of these things work together. Otherwise, you're going to be on Zoom all the time, which no one wants, or you're just writing for hours, and that's exhausting too. There has to be a balance. And so I think those are the tools that we really lean into. We do give each team the autonomy to say, hey, we prefer this tool or that tool, whatever works for them. But we make sure that everybody has training from the day they start on the tools they're going to be using, because what's more intimidating, right? You start, you don't even know how to open your email, and email is where you're going to find out what you're supposed to do for the day. So we make sure that everybody is fully trained and comfortable on those tools so that they can just get to work.
One of the things I'd mentioned, or I said, I'm a big believer in the idea of all these companies that are looking to get people back in the office, right? Even though they've seen productivity was like through the roof during the pandemic. And my sense of it was, for the last 10-something years, we have used cloud-based collaborative tools, even in office. So we were using Figma to do designs, or InVision to do designs. We're using Google Sheet. We're using some tool, even when we're sitting in the same conference room, putting things into Jira, into Trello. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hit, like you remove the office. Well, the tools didn't change. So people were able to be as productive because they were just using the same tools. Where the real gap was like the relationship, was the water cooler moments, was the conversations, was the engagement. Like those tools really, I'll say haven't been there. There's been definitely ways to kind of hack your way, like I've done for many years, and especially my time in InVision. But I've always been a believer, okay, now post-pandemic, that's when all these tools that really will be focused on relationship building and culture and engagement will start blossoming them, because okay, we've had all the work tools. Those are, you get bored of those already. Like now we need those pieces. Okay, now that you're not going to see your colleagues maybe more than once a year, how you building relationships, how you making those connections. And those I think are super important to be moving forward. To one of your points, I think 2 year points. So I'm a big believer that the future of remote work is asynchronous by default. Again, as you spoke about before, right? It's based on output, right? Presence and all the things like that. To me, totally outdated. Remote is moving in that direction, where I think even the idea of 9 to 5 and like the 4-day work week, like that's all kind of going to go by the wayside. But we'd love to hear, because again, you mentioned that you have asynchronous tools. So it seems like there is some type of process. There are some things going on at HubSpot now to better prepare for async. We'd love to hear like what work you're doing, what you're thinking about, and especially on the side of like the relationship building and the connections between employees. Because again, right, everybody knows how to write in a Google Doc, right? You can always easy enough replace that or use Slack potentially in the right way or move to Twist or something like that. But especially with an async and even more than remote, where again, you're not talking so much, all the time, it's much more deep work. Like, how are you even thinking about now? How are we going to build relationships? Like, how are we going to build those deep kind of connections within the team when obviously the future of work moves towards more asynchronous by default? It's a tongue twister here.
Yeah. Well, I think, to your earlier point, in terms of training people on just how to use asynchronous best practices and the tools there, I think one thing that's been really helpful for us is we have an internal communications guide that we give to every employee. And, it's interesting. I think for a lot of us, things like Slack, writing in a Google Sheet, as you mentioned, It seems really intuitive, but then you've got someone who, has never been in the tech industry, or someone who has their first job out of college and they don't know it, or they don't know the nuances. Right? I used to get questions all the time.
Interesting.
Can I use emojis on Slack if I'm talking to my boss? It seems like such a silly question, but it's
interesting.
Because you're not observing the other behaviors that you would see in an office, right? You don't know if it's okay or not. And so our internal communications team came out with really just rules of the road. Which channels do you use for which types of communication? What do response times look like? What are some of the acronyms that we use? And what is sort of the style of writing that we have here so that folks have some idea of what it looks like to communicate across the company? So that's been super helpful to us. And then that also has lent itself to building relationships in an asynchronous or in a virtual environment. So things that have worked well for us, I know a lot of folks use things like Donut and Shuffle. We have a HubSpot built app in our Slack infrastructure that basically just matches people on a cadence that you define, a number of people that you define.
Nice.
And so we encourage folks to connect that way. And that tool itself can be added to things like our ERG Slack rooms. You can connect based on something you're passionate about. It can be added to our interest-based Slack rooms. So I'm in a crochet HubSpot Slack room.
Nice.
And I can be matched with other people that's
crucially important.
Crochet. Exactly. You'd be surprised how many crochet Zooms I've been on at this point. But I think what we try to think about is where can we help people find sort of a common ground, whether that's by interest, by location. We have a Slack map of where everyone is in the world. So if you're in Nebraska, you can find the other folks who are in Nebraska and meet up with them. And we've taken that a step further as well. We have a remote meetup stipend. So even if you're not in an office or traveling back to an office, we want folks to find some communication or rather some community locally. We help them find out, who's in your area. Here's some money to grab a coffee with them. Or
that's awesome.
Work together with them for the day, watch the company meeting perhaps. And a lot of those efforts, I think, allowing folks to do the meeting themselves, but giving them the avenues to find each other and find that common ground has been most successful for us. But honestly, that's a place we're still learning and growing. I'm curious, you've been at so many different remote places. At a place like Envision, where it's completely remote, how did you all build community there when there was no common ground, no office necessarily to go back to?
I think similar to what you said, it really came through Slack itself, creating channels and sub-channels and kind of connecting on specific topics. It came down to leaders, hopefully being good leaders and creating those opportunities, for the team to get together. I run my 2 teams now, Cloud App asynchronously. So all the work portion of stuff like team meetings, one-on-ones are done asynchronously. And every other week we get together as a team and we play games, or we do like a show and tell or something, just for the opportunity. It's not about work. It's just get these people together, let them have some face time, let them interact. And it's all about that, in remote intentionality. So leaders have to understand, hey, these people aren't seeing each other often, however often it is. We need to go and build those relations. We need to intentionally create those opportunities. So some of the things, yes, kind of are grassroots, the things like a Slack or a crocheting channel or a parents channel or a pets channel or something like that. And again, I think it's, company leaders have to say, okay, how do we create those intentional opportunities outside of like the whole IRL? And I love that idea. I've heard a couple of companies that use the kind of incentivize employees to go meet or work with each other. And I think that's absolutely a fantastic idea, especially in the sense of, like, at best, I mean, if you have endless funding, I mean, realistically, how often is an IRL? Once a year, twice a year, maybe if you do team. And so in most, probably people are maybe getting to meet each other 2 times a year, 3 times a year. What do you do in between them and those times? So yes, you have all the virtual, but if you have that opportunity where, again, you have a person, 2 people in Nebraska, and say, hey, go meet up somewhere in the middle. We'll pay for like the transportation costs from one person to the other. We'll pay for lunch. And again, it's not paying for a whole company to get together. It's paying, okay, maybe $50 for lunch and gas or a train ticket from point A to point B. I love that. I love to hear, again, all these things that you've been thinking about and doing, like the right way to be running these things for so long. So kind of pull it back into something that we've obviously spoken about here, that HubSpot is a hybrid company. From your perspective, obviously from HubSpot's perspective, like what is the future purpose of an office look like? I think, again, my point is it actually has nothing to do with work. No work really gets done there. Again, it's really for people to kind of get together. But I'd love to hear, again, what are you thinking about? Because how many offices do you have? And like, I know like the great things I've heard are like Dropbox and Salesforce, like they've gutted their offices. They've totally redesigned them to be kind of like, I'll call them like hangout places. And this was something I spoke about on like 3 or 4 episodes on season 1, where the future office will be like a coffee house where you have small tables, you hang out, like you have a good time. And like the reemergence of the ping pong table, right? They always argue, oh no, ping pong table, that's not the culture. I said, in the future, it's probably going to be, because if you're going to have the opportunity to get together and spend time like that once a week that you're coming in or what have you. But we'd love to hear like what is HubSpot thinking about of the office, how the office is, like you keep a central headquarters and maybe go more micro spaces. We'd love to kind of hear like what you guys are thinking about over there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's so much talk around, the office is either it's in or it's out. I think for us, it's like the office it's not dead, but it's different.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big thing for us. One thing we do recognize is that, to our earlier conversation, some people do their best work in an office, and we're not going to take that away from those people.
Sure.
And so what we have had to learn, and this has really been a journey for us, is what do those folks want the office to look like? Because if we think about it, if the folks that do their best work in an office surrounded by other people are going to an office and there's no one else there, or they're going into an office only to be on Zoom the whole time, they're still not getting what they need.
Yep.
And so that's been a challenge for us. We have an incredible collaboration team and business infrastructure team, and they've been really doing a ton of surveys and just meeting rooms with folks to understand, like, what did your day look like in the office?
Yeah.
What was hard? What did you expect that you didn't see?
Sure.
And they've been reworking and experimenting with spaces so that we have more pure collaboration spaces. So like you mentioned, sort of those open spaces with couches, big meeting rooms. They've also been thinking about, for hybrid meetings, if you're going into an office, we don't just want you sitting on your desk at a laptop the whole time. So they're reworking our meeting rooms to make sure that, there's always 2 screens. So you can see remote people and you can see what's shared on the screen always at the same time.
Sure.
And
that's interesting.
Yeah, it's been really, really interesting.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, because of course, you want to make sure that truly remote people who are zoomed in or dialed in, however the case is, are always fully present. They shouldn't just be a voice.
Sure.
So that's one thing we believe really strongly in. And we're also just thinking about, what is the office going to look like for productivity? So do we need more smaller meeting rooms where people can go in there to focus? We've got folks who, again, they had the 5 roommate situation or 4 kids. They need a quiet space, and that's what they want. So we're reworking a lot of the offices to accommodate for those needs and making sure that we're listening to employees and pivoting as needed. And we frankly had to pivot a lot. But I think that's one thing I really love about that team is that they're open to the fact that they might get it right. They might also need to keep working at it for a while,
for sure.
and that's going to be worth it.
Absolutely. I think so much with the future of work, I get so excited to think about all the possibilities, and it's going to take time, right? Some things are going to work, some things are not going to work, some things are going to work 50%, and it's all going to be like a learning experience. And I think to that will come, to my last question, because I know we're running out of time. And I'm a big believer that most remote companies today, what I like to call bucket 3 companies, are simply doing remote wrong, right? They're still stuck in their office-based methodologies, endless sync meetings and hiring just regionally, and so many of these other office-based practices that are obviously not aligned with the future of work. For you, who obviously have been doing this pre-pandemic, whose role was to kind of build this remote infrastructure and moving forward, obviously all the work that you've done, what advice can you give company leaders and individual leaders to help them ensure that they're moving forward in the right way to meet the expectations of the future of work, right? Because soon, I like to debate this point quite often, right? The idea of remote is a benefit or a perk, that's done. Like, remote is now where we work. Like, the next thing is how we work, and that's going to be very much focused on like asynchronous. So again, soon will be like the idea of forcing people back to the office is the same thing of synchronous meetings, right? So if you're not offering asynchronous by default, well, it's just as good as forcing somebody back to an office. But many of these people, again, have been stuck in this old way of working. So again, as someone who's obviously been leading and building with a great organization, like, what advice can you give leaders of like, hey, this is what you need to be thinking on, this is what you need to be focusing on, again, as we move forward with the future of work?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that you can't, just as you mentioned, you can't copy and paste your office way of working into a remote environment. It will not work. It's just not going to scale. It's not going to work. People aren't going to be happy. And so I think knowing that, start from scratch. When it comes to thinking about a hybrid environment and how that's going to scale, don't think about how are we going to get A, B, and C from the office into a remote world. Start over, rewrite. And I think as you're doing that, you have to listen to your employees, because one thing that is true, you and I both know this, when it comes to remote work, everyone's experience is personal. It's unique.
Sure.
What works for you in the US might not work for your employees for us in Japan. Right? So making sure that as you are thinking about that playbook, is it going to scale? Is it going to work globally? Have you listened to your employees and actually iterated on that feedback? Those 3 things I think are huge. But I would also just challenge everyone to ask themselves, what is the purpose of anything you're implementing? If you're going to ask someone to keep their Slack doc green, what's the purpose of that, right? What's the purpose behind it? And if you can't answer that question in a way you're proud of, it's not something you should implement. So it's not an easy answer. I think it's something that takes a lot of work and a lot of iteration, but it is so worth it to be able to provide an environment for employees across the world to do their best work.
I think the most important, point that you made, at least from my sense, it's listen to your employees. This is what has baffled me for the last year and a half. Very clear, 70-80% of employees expect full flexibility. It's either for them to decide when and where and how they're going to work. Yet you see the Apples and the Facebooks, and Teslas, you're going back to your office. But it's been clear, you've spent millions, especially Google, which I think to me is the most baffling, because they've done all these fantastic research projects internally around culture and HR. You've spent millions of dollars gathering feedback around this whole remote thing, and it's been crystal clear. You have a good chunk of people that want to be fully remote. You have a good chunk that most people want flexibility. So where did all that go wrong? And they're like, no, you're going back to the office. Like, what was this point of spending all this time and money getting the feedback to say we want flexibility if you then decide, no, we're not going to give you flexibility? Totally baffling to me. But Meaghan, again, thank you so much. My whole idea, I never really knew HubSpot of being really a kind of a pioneer and leading all this. And you always hear about the GitLabs and the Doists, which have done absolutely fantastic work. But for me, even doing this so long, I know I heard of HubSpot, but it was never kind of in the same realm. But to hear all the work and all the great things that have been implemented, even back since 2019 that you've been working on, and all this stuff has been there. It's absolutely fantastic. How can people who are listening get a hold of you, get in contact with you? And is there the publicly facing documents, like all the stuff that you've mentioned that you've been giving to leaders and managers? Is some of this publicly facing? If it is, how do people get a hold of it? And we certainly want to put it in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is MCW22. And then in terms of our strategy, so if you go to HubSpot.com/hybrid, you'll see a lot of our hybrid approach there.
Awesome.
And the documents linked. You can also search the HubSpot blog for the topic of hybrid. A lot of folks around the company have written about the way that we train managers, best practices, things we've learned along the way. So there's tons of documentations there as well.
That's awesome. So Meaghan, again, thank you so much. It was fantastic to have the conversation. Fantastic to hear all the amazing work that you've done there at HubSpot and all the great things that HubSpot is doing and thinking about doing and really leading the charge for the future work. So I greatly appreciate the time, and for everyone listening, until the next episode, have a great day.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's show. I really hope you enjoyed it. My aim is for everyone listening to have one takeaway from each episode they can then go and use with their teams. If you enjoyed the show, please feel free to support me by subscribing in your favorite podcasting app, on our YouTube channel, share it with friends and colleagues, and please feel free to buy me a coffee via the show's website.